And I am here in London and I'm doing my first Facebook Live with you. And good morning, everyone. It's great to be here doing very first Artcore Facebook Live talk. My name is Rachel Giles and I'm a freelance writer, editor and book project manager. And this weekend, we're actually starting tomorrow, it's the Big Book Weekend, and this is a coming together of all of the book festivals in the UK that were sadly cancelled because of the coronavirus. And so it seems appropriate that I'm going to be talking to you about books. That's my passion. That's what I do for a living. And in particular, some very, very big books. Most of the books I work on are really quite big. So I'm going to be talking about these books, which are mainly to do with art, architecture, and design. So I work for a range of different clients. I'm self-employed, and I work for a lot of museums and art galleries. And these include the V&A, the National Gallery, and publishers of art and design books such as Phaidon and Scala. So today I'm going to be talking to you about two areas of my work. The first is about writing and working on projects just like this, Living on Vacation, which is my latest book, which is written all by me. And I'm going to tell you about how I ended up being a writer and doing this sort of work, what's involved. And I'll be giving you some tips if you're an aspiring writer on how to get started and what some of the difficulties are of writing and how to overcome those. So I hope that'll be helpful. I also do a bit of copywriting for arts organisations, and I've worked for organisations like DACS, which is the Designers and Artists Copyright Society. So I'll be talking about some books I've worked on, and then the other part of what I do is making books. So I am a freelance editor and book project manager. So I help museums and galleries put together books like this. So try and get this right. This is a catalogue which I did for the National Gallery a couple of years ago called Painters' Paintings. And I'll be talking a little bit about the process of how books get put together if there's time. So all quite complicated projects. Every project is different. Sometimes books can take a lot of time to produce, especially illustrated ones, because the important thing is the imagery, and that is just as important as the text. And I'll be taking some questions at the end of this live session. So just to tell you a little bit about me first, I'm from Cheshire. I grew up in a place called Frodsham, which is near Chester, and I now live in London. I've always loved words and books from an early age, and I love writing stories. And when I was a kid, I wanted to be a journalist. In fact, I did do a work experience slot with a local newspaper called the Runcorn Guardian, and that mainly involved making tea. But I did end up writing a few press releases and interviewing a few local people, which was really cool. I then went to university to study modern languages, and that really is another passion of mine. And I finally got my first job into publishing for a career services publisher in Manchester. But my first role there was doing telesales, and that definitely wasn't my calling. But luckily, I found a way into doing what I love doing, which was working with words. And so I moved into some editorial work. So after that, my first editorial publishing job was working for an educational publisher in Leeds called Thomas Nelson and Sons, which no longer exists, but it used to have an office up in Leeds. And so I ended up working on creating German courses for secondary school students. A few years later, I moved into museum publishing, and that really was my dream job because it kind of brought together words, books, pictures, and culture and museums. And I was head of publishing at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. And I was there for about 9 years, and I set up the publishing department there and did some fantastic books on everything from travel to astronomy, children's books, books about the collections, guidebooks, and all sorts of amazing things. But after that, I decided that I wanted to focus on working with my own writing. I really enjoy helping other people to be creative and to express themselves through publishing. But I thought it was time I had a go at doing my own writing. So I did an MA in professional writing at London Metropolitan University, and I did that full time for a year. And that's really what helped me to change direction and move in to start writing about my own ideas or about the art world itself. So after that, I freelanced and I wrote exhibition reviews of major exhibitions, things like the David Bowie exhibition at the V&A, Alexander McQueen. I got to go to the press launches, which was a fantastic experience. And I did that for a magazine called Third Way, which is sadly no longer with us, which is often a tale to be told in publishing. There's always a lot of changes and a lot of takeovers and shifts. So being in publishing often means being able to be flexible and find different ways of surviving. But I really enjoyed that. I wrote exhibition reviews and I did some feature writing as well for publications like Church Times and a few others. To be honest, it can be pretty tough trying to make a living from just writing. So I went back in-house after that, and I worked as a project editor at the National Gallery. And I stayed there for 5 years working on exhibition catalogues, like this book that I showed you earlier. So after that, I went full-time freelance to write and to do freelance book project management and editorial. So here I am. So I'm going to talk about the writing side of what I do now. And over the last 2 years, I've contributed to 5 books by the art publisher Phaidon. And these are on architecture and design, so house design and interior design. And living on vacation, good exercise, is the latest one. Still getting to grips with this camera. And this beast is the Atlas of Brutalist Architecture, which I'll talk about in a minute. So I've done 5. I'll give you you can see there's a little pile of them building up behind me. And this Atlas of Brutalist Architecture is an amazing book. And you might be wondering, well, what is brutalist architecture? It's become very, very hip recently and found a new popularity again through things like Instagram. And basically, it is what it says on the front. It's 850 of the world's best brutalist buildings. And there's no other book as comprehensive as this in terms of brutalist architecture. And brutalism is a style of architecture that became an important movement between the 1950s to roughly the 1970s, and it was worldwide. There were quite a few brutalist buildings in the UK. So if you're thinking, well, what would an example be of that? The National Theatre in London is one example. There's the Trellick Tower in London, Preston Bus Station, Dunelm House at Durham University. But a lot of it has been knocked down because it's after initial sort of surge in popularity between the 50s and the 70s, it then fell out of favour for various reasons. And a lot of it has been destroyed or is due for demolition or is abandoned. And this book seeks to kind of bring together the best examples of brutalist architecture throughout the world. And it wasn't just in the UK. This book covers Africa, India. There's a great deal of brutalist architecture in America and right throughout Europe, all around the world. Now, what does brutalist mean? Well, a lot of people think brutalist means, well, it looks really brutal because the kind of buildings that you see, I'll just try and show you something. If I can lift it. Whoa. They're quite what you might say aggressive cubic designs. Some people say, oh, they look really brutal and they're grey because they're made of concrete. But the origin of the word brutalism is actually from béton brut, which is French for raw concrete. And they're made of concrete, and concrete is poured into molds, and then you can get these fantastic textures from the molds that the concrete's poured into. So they can be made of wood, and you can get these wonderful wood effects on the concrete itself. So it's the raw concrete, béton brut, which actually gives brutalism its name. And this was a style that was embraced as something that was fairly utopian. It had quite left-wing leanings. It was cheap. Concrete's cheap, and it's a material that's easy to get hold of. It was often used for things like civic buildings, universities, council offices, private homes, but it was also used for a lot of churches, which a lot of people don't realise. And after the Second Vatican Council, between 1962 and 5, the Catholic Church wanted to create a more modern image and try and renegotiate its relationship with the modern world. So there was a flourishing of church building, and a lot of buildings that were built then by the church were brutalist in style. And the fantastic thing about concrete, and I've become a massive fan of concrete through writing this book, is that it can be moulded in all sorts of ways. So you can get amazing curving forms, you can get really solid cubic forms. They can be as blank as you like, they can be really abstract. And they can look fantastic in bright sunlight and create wonderful patterns of shadow. So it's a very architectural, sculptural form of building. So in terms of the writing process of this book, I wrote about 300 buildings, and it was a big project. It took about 5 months to write, and it was quite a punishing schedule. And the publisher would send me lists of buildings to write about, and then I would research them. And unfortunately, I didn't get to visit all of the buildings all around the world. That's just not how it works, and publishers don't have the budget to do that. But it was a really interesting experience. So the research was done online. I had contact with the architects to get the best and most interesting information. And I also had a fascinating exchange with the archivist in Lucerne about their municipal car park, which I'm pleased to say I've added to the research on that's out there on that. This is real geek territory, and I am a geek. So when it comes to concrete, anyway. So following that, I've worked on other architecture titles, one on classic designs for everyday objects called The Design Book, and most recently Living on Vacation. So it's a bit more glamorous than the concrete, perhaps. And I was asked to write on that last spring, and it's a very lovely collection of the world's most beautiful vacation homes and retreats, from the tiniest cabin on a cliff top in Norway to the most amazing desert retreat. Books divided up into islands, mountains, forests, lakes, rivers, and ponds. And I'll try and show you just how lovely it is. So it's quite hard to show you, but these are really interesting, beautiful retreats. It's very image driven and has the best photography, but again, I didn't get to visit the homes, unfortunately. I wrote to a list and I wrote to a commission. Now I can see that we're running out of time, so I'm just going to talk about challenges for writers. Writer's block is often talked about, and there's nothing like a deadline to focus the mind and to get you writing. But having said that, what can create havoc for a writer is actually worrying that something might not be good enough, or what you've written, your first draft, is rubbish. And the way around this is really just to simply write, to get writing, not to stop if you feel that what you're doing isn't good enough. And this applies to a lot of creatives, I'm sure, that you just have to get going and then work with what you've got. So what I do when I'm feeling a bit unhappy with what I've written is to set the timer on my phone for, say, 15 minutes, and then just write anything. It doesn't matter if it's rubbish or doesn't make much sense. I just collect the most interesting facts about the building that I'm writing about, or whatever it is, and then I redraft, hone it and polish it. And I think that's about working with discomfort, and being okay to feel uncomfortable with what you're doing. It can be lonely. Writing can send you a bit nuts. So I go out, I go for a walk, take breaks. I often write in cafes. That's what I used to. I don't anymore because of the pandemic. So writing can be very solitary, but you do get to know the local freelance community through working in cafes. Try and avoid cliches. It's an obvious one, it's a cliche, but try and think of better ways to say something like these books, that not just is idyllic, and stick to the brief. If you are given a brief, just stick to it. It's just not worth the aggro of trying to tell a publisher that they're wrong about something, unless you negotiate that up front. Do look for other sources of income if you can. And really running out of time now. So that's, for me, editing and book project management. And again, I get a lot of joy working with writers and other writers, photographers, museums, and their wonderful collections to gather all the material for exhibition catalogues. Again, that can be quite challenging, especially if things are running late, but that's all part of the fun, and making something beautiful at the end of the day to sell and generate income for museums and galleries, but also to kind of take the exhibition into the home, something that people can take away with them. So it's a difficult time at the moment for writers, editors, freelancers and creatives. I know that, and I hope you're all doing okay. If you're in similar situation to me, it's going to be tough for the next year or so, but I think that we'll get through it, because people are creative and they always come up with solutions. So thank you very much for listening and for tuning in. I'm really happy to answer any questions through chat. Yeah, thank you, and stay well. And thank you very much for listening to me